Greetings friends. Thanks for stopping by for a visit. If you enjoy the video, please subscribe.
A few years ago, I went camping in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan with my uncle and cousin. I've told this story to a few people in person, but I've never really posted it online before because honestly I still don't know what to make of it. For some context, this wasn't some deep wilderness backpacking trip. We were staying at a pretty decent-sized campground. It was one of those places with dozens of campsites spread out through the woods, fire rings, bathrooms, the whole deal. The thing was, it was late in the season, so maybe only 10 to 15% of the sites were actually occupied. That ended up making the place feel kind of strange. You drive through these loops of campsites and see empty site after empty site. Then randomly there'd be one occupied with a camper or tent. The woods felt bigger because of it. Quieter too. The first day was completely normal. We got there around noon, checked in, found our site, and started unloading gear. My uncle has camped his entire life and basically runs the show on trips like this. My cousin and I mostly just carried stuff while he told us where everything should go. While we were unloading, there was an older guy in a neighboring site maybe 100 yards away. He was talking to another camper and I remember hearing him say something like, "Well, if it comes around tonight, you'll hear it." I didn't think much of it at the time. The other guy laughed and asked, "The bear again?" The older guy shrugged and said, "Maybe." That was the end of it as far as I could hear. A little later my cousin and I walked up toward the camp store to grab ice. There were a few people hanging around outside. Nothing unusual. Just campers talking. As we were walking past, one woman was telling a story about hearing something outside her camper a few years earlier. I only caught part of it, but she said it sounded like something pacing around her site for half the night. Another guy interrupted and said, "You probably heard the same thing everybody else does." A couple people laughed. The woman didn't. She just kind of shook her head and said, "No, this was different." Again, I didn't really think much about it. Every campground has local stories. Usually it's bears, mountain lions, escaped animals, weird neighbors, whatever. That night we got a fire going and cooked dinner. A few sites nearby had fires going too. Since the campground wasn't crowded, conversations carried farther than you'd expect. At one point we could hear a group of campers talking a few sites over. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but one thing caught my attention. One guy said, "My grandpa always told us not to go wandering around out here after dark." Someone asked why. There was a pause before he answered. Then he said, "Because there are things in these woods that aren't bears." Everybody laughed after that. The conversation moved on. I remember looking over at my uncle and making some joke about locals trying to scare tourists. My uncle laughed too and said something like, "Every place has a monster story." That was pretty much my attitude. If you'd asked me that night, I would have said the whole thing was just local folklore. Small town stories people pass around because it's fun. The kind of thing that gets exaggerated every time someone tells it. Still, looking back, what sticks with me isn't any one story. It's how many little comments we heard. Not one person sat us down and told us a big scary campfire tale. It was always pieces of conversations. Random remarks. Half-finished stories. People laughing about something they didn't really want to explain. At the time I brushed all of it off. But after what happened later in the trip, those conversations started sounding very different in my memory. That first night honestly wasn't that eventful. We stayed up around the fire for a few hours, had a couple drinks, told stories, and eventually turned in. The campground got really quiet once the sun went down. Not completely silent, but quiet enough that you could hear people talking from sites pretty far away. I slept in a tent while my uncle and cousin shared another one a short distance away. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I don't know exactly what time it was. My phone was dead and I wasn't about to go digging for a charger. At first I wasn't even sure what woke me up. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. Not running. Not crashing through the woods. Just walking. Slow. Crunch. 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 I remember laying there listening for a few seconds. It sounded like something moving through the woods beyond our campsite. Not right next to us, but definitely close enough to hear. My first thought was bear. We were in the Upper Peninsula. Bears exist. End of mystery. The weird thing was how long I listened to it. Usually if I hear an animal while camping, I just roll over and go back to sleep. For some reason, I stayed awake. The footsteps would stop for a bit, then start again somewhere else. After maybe a minute or two, everything went quiet. Eventually, I fell back asleep. The next morning, while we were making breakfast, my cousin randomly asked, "Did either of you hear something walking around last night?" That got my attention. I told him I had. My uncle looked up from the camp stove and said he heard it too. "What do you think it was?" my cousin asked. "Bear probably," my uncle said. Then after a second he added, "Big one though." I remember laughing and saying that sounded reassuring. Nobody seemed too concerned about it, and the conversation moved on. Still, it was the first time during the trip that one of those weird campground stories popped back into my head. Not because I thought they were true, just because it was a little strange that all three of us had heard the same thing. The second day was when things started getting a little weird. Not because anything happened directly to us, but because the stories we'd been hearing started sounding less like random campfire tales and more like people describing the same thing without actually saying it. Most of the day was normal. We hiked some trails, did some fishing, and spent way too much time arguing about who forgot to bring what. That afternoon my cousin and I ended up talking with a couple from another campsite while we were filling water bottles. The conversation drifted toward wildlife. The woman mentioned hearing what she thought was a dog barking somewhere in the woods the night before. That wouldn't have been strange, except there weren't supposed to be any dogs in that part of the campground. Her husband immediately shook his head. It wasn't a dog. She rolled her eyes. Whatever it was, it sounded like one. The husband looked uncomfortable for some reason. Then he said something that stuck with me. It sounded too deep. That was it. He wouldn't elaborate. The conversation moved on, but I remember thinking it was a weird thing to say. Later that evening, just before dark, my uncle was talking with an older guy who had been camping there for years. I only caught part of their conversation. The older guy asked if we'd heard anything unusual at night. My uncle laughed and mentioned the footsteps. The guy nodded like that wasn't surprising at all. Then he said, "If you hear it again, stay in camp." I remember looking over at him expecting him to laugh or explain what he meant. He didn't. He just changed the subject. The whole thing left me with this strange feeling that everybody knew some local story except us. That night we had another fire going. The temperature dropped fast after sunset and there was almost no wind. Around 10 or 11, while we were sitting there talking, we heard a sound somewhere out in the woods. At first I thought it was a wolf. I've heard wolves before though, and this wasn't quite right. The closest thing I can compare it to is a bark mixed with a howl. It was deeper than a dog but shorter than a wolf call. The sound echoed through the trees and then everything went quiet. Nobody said anything for a few seconds. Then my cousin asked, "Was that what those people were talking about?" My uncle stared out toward the tree line. Normally he always had an explanation for stuff. Bears, coyotes, wolves, hunters, whatever. This time he just shrugged. "I don't know." For some reason that answer bothered me more than the sound itself. This is the part one still don't really like thinking about, and honestly I've rewritten it a few times because it sounds ridiculous even to me. It happened the last night we were there. We were all pretty on edge by that point, even if nobody wanted to admit it. My uncle kept the fire going longer than usual, like he didn't want the darkness to settle in too early. The campground was even quieter than the nights before. I remember noticing that we hadn't heard anyone else laughing or talking in a while. Just the woods. We were sitting around the fire around maybe midnight or so when the sound started again. Footsteps. Same as the first night, but closer this time. Not rushing, not wandering, just steady, like something walking a perimeter. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. My cousin stopped talking mid-sentence. My uncle looked up like he was trying to decide if he should say something or ignore it. I grabbed a flashlight without really thinking. We all kind of just sat there listening. The footsteps got closer, then stopped. Dead silence. That silence felt worse than the noise. My uncle finally stood up and shined his light toward the edge of the trees. The beam cut through the dark but didn't really reach far enough to show anything useful. Just trunks and brush. At first there was nothing. Then I saw the eyes. I don't know how else to describe it. Two reflective points, low at first, then higher than they should have been. Like whatever was standing there wasn't on all fours. My uncle shifted the light a bit, and that's when we saw more of it. I don't even want to say clear, because it wasn't. It was like the thing didn't fully register in the light, like parts of it were just missing in shadow. But what I remember is the shape. Tall, easily over 6 feet, broad shoulders, and a head that looked wrong in a way I can't really explain without sounding stupid. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a wolf. It looked like a dog's head, but set on something that stood upright like a person. My cousin whispered, "What the hell is that?" But it came out almost under his breath. Nobody moved. Nobody even really breathed for a second. The thing just stood there. Not pacing. Not acting like an animal caught in headlights. Just standing. And I swear it felt like it was looking directly at us. My uncle raised the light a little higher, and that's when it moved. It didn't run. It just stepped backward into the trees. One step. Then another. Slow, like it knew exactly where everything was behind it. The last thing I clearly saw was the eyes again, briefly caught between branches, before it shifted fully out of the beam. Then there was a sound behind the trees. Not loud, just movement, like it had already gone a long distance in seconds. My uncle turned off the flashlight. I remember asking him why, and he just said, "Don't keep it on it." We sat there for a while after that without talking. The fire kept cracking, normal as ever, like nothing had just happened. But none of us moved from that spot until morning. We didn't really sleep after that. I stayed up most of the night just listening to the woods. Every small sound felt like it meant something now. My cousin eventually fell asleep, but I could tell it wasn't deep. My uncle stayed awake longer than both of us. Nobody talked about what we saw. Not right away. In the morning, it was just kind of understood we were leaving. We packed up fast, like almost in silence. No one was joking around anymore. Even simple stuff like rolling sleeping bags felt different, like we were trying not to make noise in case something was still out there watching. As we were driving out, I noticed a couple other campers were leaving too. That might have been coincidence. I don't know. At one point we passed a truck stopped near the exit, and the guy inside looked at us and asked, "You guys hear it last night?" My uncle just nodded once. The guy didn't explain what it meant. He just said, "Yeah, that's usually when people go home early." We didn't really talk much on the drive back. My uncle still says it was probably a bear. My cousin won't really discuss it at all. Me, I don't know. I just know I've never heard anything like that before or since, and I've been camping a lot. I don't try to explain it anymore. I just remember it.
Thanks for watching. If you want to hear more stories like these, please like and subscribe.